Hello and welcome to the Dailies. US media remained focused on the end of the government shutdown, dissecting the political fallout and compromises that made it possible. Meanwhile, the BBC's leadership crisis continued to dominate headlines in Britain. And across the Arab world, news of the first Syrian presidential visit to the White House since 1946 resonated widely, seen as a symbolic diplomatic turning point. And coverage of Iraq's parliamentary elections, however, was far more restrained, marked by deep skepticism and little expectation of real reform. We'll start with American media, which continued to cover the federal government's reopening developments, and many outlets framed the Senate's bipartisan vote as a relief for workers, but a political setback for Democrats, who dropped key healthcare demands. Reports stressed the mounting economic toll of the 40-day shutdown, from unpaid workers to flight chaos. Coverage also underscored Donald Trump's growing influence over Republican strategy and his role in pressuring Democrats to concede. The New York Times examines President Trump's calculated response to the Senate's deal to end the historic 40-day government shutdown. The report explains that while backing the agreement to reopen federal agencies, Trump used the moment to reassert his policy priorities, particularly reshaping healthcare, funding towards individuals instead of insurers. It highlights how the compromise achieved through rare bipartisan cooperation offered only temporary relief, leaving Democrats without their key demand to extend Affordable Care Act subsidies. The piece also presents Trump's stance as both pragmatic and opportunistic, a short-term acceptance of defeat to secure long-term influence over future budget and health policy negotiations. Politico details a sharp internal backlash within the Democratic Party after 8 Senate Democrats broke ranks, even though Schumer himself voted against it. The report says angry Democrats and progressives accused Schumer of losing control of his party and failing to protect key goals, like keeping the Affordable Care Act tax credits from expiring. Now, the piece also notes that some even demanded his replacement, sparking questions about his viability as leader. It concludes that the events reveal deep strategic and ideological fractures in the party amid a crisis over budget, healthcare, and leadership. American outlets also put some focus on a major diplomatic realignment. Syria has agreed to formally join the US-led coalition against Islamic State, coinciding with President Donald Trump's historic meeting with Syrian President Al-Sharaa. The Wall Street Journal frames this move as a significant pivot. Syria, long viewed as a US adversary, now cooperates on counter-terrorism, offering intelligence and military assistance. Meanwhile, Washington signals readiness to ease sanctions and also broaden engagement with Damascus. Yet the piece underscores the complexity. The terms of Syria's contribution remain indeed vague, and also regional allies like Israel and Turkey are watching carefully. Also on Syria, Foreign Policy examines Al-Sharaa's first parliamentary elections as Syria's leader after a regime change, casting them as a symbolic milestone rather than a genuine democratic transition. Now, while thousands of Syrians were allowed to vote in the October 5th contest under a new constitution, the newly elected legislator lacks meaningful power to challenge the executive. The piece also shows that Sharaa still holds broad powers, from choosing officials to controlling new laws. Critics argue that his so-called reforms simply rebrand the same authoritarian system under a new name. What's being presented as a democratic test looks more like a tightly managed show of legitimacy meant to impress foreign allies rather than give real power to the Syrian people. Arab and Syrian media largely portrayed Ahmed Al-Sharaa's visit to the White House as a historic shift in Syria-US relations, framing it as a return of Syria from isolation and a chance for reconstruction. At the same time, reports noted underlying caution, pointing out that many key details such as sanctions relief and regional security guarantees still remained unresolved. The state-run Syrian news agency Sana frames Ahmed Al-Sharaa's official visit to Washington and his meeting with Donald Trump as a landmark revival of Syria's global standing. His being the first Syrian president to visit the White House since 1946 indeed bolsters the narrative of national resurgence. The piece emphasizes U.S. openness to partnering with Damascus, driven by shifts in Syria's domestic and foreign agenda, and highlights sanctions relief, particularly the repeal of the Caesar Act, as key to economic recovery. It credits Al-Sharaa with prioritizing stability and investment to restore Syria's position as a regional actor, positioning this diplomacy as historic in scope and also ambition. As for Arab media, the London-based pan-Arab daily newspaper Al-Arab analyzes Syrian president's visit and its potential to reshape decades of hostility between Damascus and Washington. It recounts Al-Sharaa's transformation from former militant to diplomatic partner, noting his talks with Donald Trump focused on counter-terrorism, reconstruction and possible sanction relief. The piece frames the visit as a pivotal but uncertain turning point. While it signals Syria's bid to rejoin the global community, deep internal divisions and regional rivalries and shifting U.S. priorities could limit its impact. The piece balances optimism about a new era with skepticism that this rapprochement might be a short-term tactical move rather than lasting reform. Arab media also covered Iraq's elections with cautious realism, portraying them as a test of stability rather than a true democratic breakthrough. Most outlets highlighted low voter turnout and public frustration with corruption and stagnant reforms. Regional analysis framed the vote within broader power struggles between Iran, the US, and the Gulf states over Iraq's political future. Al-Sharq al-Awsat portrays Iraq's 2025 parliamentary elections as a moment of deep public cynicism rather than democratic renewal. Reporting from Baghdad, it captures voters' frustration over entrenched corruption, failing services, and an elite political system that many believe is resistant to change. Younger Iraqis, especially disillusioned after years of stalled reforms and broken anti-corruption pledges, are not showing up to vote. The piece's tone is somber and reflective, suggesting that the election represents continuity, not transformation, a ritual of democracy overshadowed by mistrust, fatigue, and a widespread belief that genuine reform remains out of reach in Iraq's post-war politics. In the UK, British media continued to cover the BBC's scandal after President Trump threatened to sue the BBC for $1 billion over Panorama's speech edit and the subsequent resignations and the BBC's chairman's apology. The Times frames the broadcaster's towering crisis as something out of an Orwellian farce, a coup orchestrated by the BBC against itself. It mocks institutional self-undermining, noting how board members and international factions appear to be attacking the broadcaster from within, all while the organization insists it remains in control. The piece exposes the complexity of the scandal, the tangled governance issues, and the mounting existential pressures on the BBC's role in British public life. The Telegraph, on the other hand, reported that the British Broadcasting Corporation is about to undergo a sweeping government-led review of its TV license fee model, sparked by recent editorial controversies and concerns over public trust. The piece highlights that the broadcaster's mandatory funding mechanism payable by all households with a TV is now deemed unsustainable in an era of streaming services and rising fee evasion. The review, expected before the current charter expires in 2027, may consider options ranging from a subscription model to a large portion paid by wealthier households. Critics argue the BBC's funding and governance must adapt or face decline. And we'll end with the Middle East, as the Times of Israel reported that an external panel commissioned by the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, has judged most of the military's high-level investigations into the October 7 attack by Hamas as inadequate, with several rated outright unsatisfactory. The panel was created to assess whether the IDF's internal probes properly identified failures, implemented lessons, and held individuals accountable. The piece highlights that while Zamir expressed support for further external review, he avoided endorsing a formal state commission and announced that personal decisions against officers under question are being evaluated. It concludes the findings raise serious questions about accountability and reform at the heart of Israel's military response. Thank you for watching the Dailies, only on Al-Arabiya English.